This is something I found out when I was researching my book, Live Not by Lies. Every single one of these dissidents I interviewed in Central Europe and in Russia, every single one of them believed that they would never live to see the end of communism. They resisted because they believed in the truth more than their own comfort. And a lot of them had to suffer greatly.
I named this podcast The Uncaptive Mind in honor of Czeslaw Milosz, who's one of my very favorite writers. Whenever I feel lost in life, I reread The Captive Mind. And you are to thank for drawing attention to his work. Tell me about Milosz and what Americans and Europeans can learn from him.
Well, Czesław Milosz was a Polish poet and diplomat and a communist who defected to the West in the 1950s. And this book you're talking about, The Captive Mind, which came out in the early 50s, if I'm not mistaken, was his attempt to explain why it was that Polish intellectuals, prominent Polish intellectuals, submitted to communism, even though they knew better. And it's a complicated book because he gives profiles of 4 different intellectuals and talks about different aspects of themselves and their own mind, what drew them to it. But what was, for me, reading The Captive Mind as I was researching my book, Live Not by Lies, it really opened me up to the idea, it's in Milosz, that people can accept totalitarianism without being forced to, that there's something within totalitarianism that satisfies a deep hunger in the human soul, a hunger for meaning, a hunger for purpose, a hunger for status. Because some of these intellectuals he writes about, they, as writers, for example, in the pre-communist time, they were nobody. But under communism, if they were part of the party apparatus, suddenly they had lots of status in the society. And that helped me understand more why people in our own society today, in the United States, in the current day, accept things that they shouldn't, that anybody with a lick of common sense would know is crazy, like a man can be a woman can be a man, that it's a good idea to pump children full of hormones to destroy their fertility, and on and on and on. But Czesław Milosz understood it before any of the rest of us did. Now, he was writing about Eastern Europe, but he was really writing about the human soul.
And it's been so frustrating to watch in recent years because on one hand, I'm relieved that finally the Overton window has shifted. Finally, there's a vibe shift, which I can feel in America. People are finally telling more of the truth. And as they do so, there's this acknowledgement that many Americans were lying for years. Absolutely. And they went along with the craziness. And I think, not to point blame at others, because I found myself at times, weighing, do I say what I really think here and face the consequences, or do I play along? We all, to our own degrees, played along with craziness.
Ketman.
Yes.
That's a concept in The Captive Mind. It comes from a Persian word, or it is a Persian word, and it describes the mask you have to wear in order to continue to get along in a society where you don't believe what you're expected to say, but you have to say it anyway to maintain your position. Milosz says that the thing you have to be careful of is the mask could become your face if you do it often enough. And he says that there were some communist intellectuals who would tell themselves, I don't really believe this, but they still went along with it. Well, if you live your whole life that way, what's the difference? There's also a term that I think is so important for us to talk about to help us understand why things are the way they are today. This comes from The Captive Mind too, the pill of Murti-Bing. Now, Milosz got that from a Polish novel from the 1920s, an apocalyptic novel that's about a Mongol horde coming to Poland to invade Poland from the east. And in order to prepare the Polish people to accept their domination, they distribute this thing called the pill of Murti-Bing. And what the pill does is it calms people down. It helps them accept their domination and be at peace with it. And Czeslaw Milosz uses this in the book to talk about the strategies people use to reconcile themselves with the irreconcilable. So I'm living in Europe now, right? I'm an American, but I've been living in Hungary for 4 years, and I follow a lot of what's happening in European politics, but also in American politics. What we have seen in the United States until just recently, and what is still very much there in the UK, is a massive binging on the pill of Murti-Bing. What do I mean by that? In Britain now, for example, they have this tremendous problem with migration and with Islamic radicalism. And you wonder, how is it that the people of Britain can withstand knowing about this, the Pakistani rape gang, which, if your listeners don't know about it, thousands of working class white English girls were systematically kidnapped, raped, and drugged by groups of Pakistani men, Muslim men, in England. The police knew about it, the authorities knew about it, the media knew about it, and nobody said anything, you know? And even now, the country is finally getting upset about it, but it's still not nearly the kind of outrage that you would expect. I think it's the effect of the pill of Murti-Bing, which is to say, if they allowed themselves to deal with the reality of what was in front of them, they would tear the place apart. Mm-hmm. And they would be so furious at their rulers, for the ruling class, for allowing this to go on. But the pill of Murti-Bing in this case tells them, no, if we object, that might be racist. That might be Islamophobic. We don't look back in anger. That was one of the campaigns up to one of the bombings. Similarly, in America, during the period of wokeness, if you dared to think a thought about transgenderism, for example, if something wrong with this, or DEI, something wrong with this, the pill of Murti-Bing would kick in and you would say, oh, no, this is progress. We need this. This is a good thing. Now, there's a difference between the pill of Murti-Bing and Ketman. In the case of Ketman, which we were just talking about, it's wrong, but you won't say anything. With the pill of Murti-Bing, you tell yourself, no, this is good. This is not bad. My instinct says it's bad, but really it's a good thing. But eventually, the pill of Murti-Bing wears off. And when that happens, boy, we have trouble.
And there's something inherently dehumanizing about both Ketman and the pill of Murti-Bing. And so that's why I like that you describe The Captive Mind as a book about the human soul. That's ultimately what it really is about. And there's this beautiful passage at the end of the book where he writes about seeing a family in a train station, and there's decay, and the family, they're poor, and there's so much that's ugly all around the family, and society is so fragmented. People aren't really looking each other in the eye. Everyone's just passing through this train station, but you have this beautiful family together in the center of all the chaos, clearly supporting one another. They clearly love each other. And he has this moment where he pauses and he remembers the importance of the soul. And he attributes that in part to his decision to tell the truth, even when it's costly, because he acknowledges that he could have been successful. He could have made good money as an academic under the regime, under the communists.
He was a diplomat
played the game.
for the communists.
Yes, he was a diplomat for the communists. He played the game for a time, and he knows that he could have kept playing the game, but he decided eventually that he couldn't do it any longer, that there was something higher beyond monetary gain and comfort and social status. There was something else that he had to serve instead.
Yeah, that reminds me of a famous passage in the book Witness by Whittaker Chambers. One of the great American memoirs, came out in the 50s after Whittaker Chambers left the U.S. Communist Party. And he became a witness in the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, testifying against the Soviet underground that was in America that he used to be a part of. And he says in the introduction, the thing that turned him was looking at the ear of his newborn daughter was holding the baby in his lap, and he noticed her ear and how intricate it was. And something clicked in him that told him, God made this. And his atheism fell apart, and with it, his communism. And he writes in the book that he realized when he was leaving communism, he said, I know I'm joining the losing side, because he still believed communism would win, but he did it because he wanted the truth and he wanted God. And this is something I found out when I was researching my book, Live Not by Lies. Every single one of these dissidents I interviewed in Central Europe and in Russia, every single one of them believed that they would never live to see the end of communism. They resisted because they believed in the truth more than their own comfort. And a lot of them had to suffer greatly. In the film version of Live Not by Lies, there's a young Slovak photographer and filmmaker named Timo Kriška. And Timo was a toddler when communism ended, and so he grew up in freedom. But there was something, he says, that was empty about the freedom he had. He had the freedom to travel, and he was a real success as a filmmaker, and on and on. But then he got interested in his great-grandfather, whom he didn't know. His great-grandfather had died. His great-grandfather was a Greek Catholic priest, which meant he could marry. And the communists in Slovakia, in Czechoslovakia then, told him, either convert to Orthodoxy, because they control the Orthodox Church, or you can't be a priest anymore. So he chose not to be a priest anymore. Of course, he was a priest, but he couldn't.
Right.
Timo wanted to know what gave him the courage to do that, to sacrifice his priesthood for the truth, rather than collaborate with the communists. But he couldn't ask the old man, so what he did was Timo went to meet old people of his great-grandfather's generation and younger, who had gone to prison for their faith and had suffered greatly. And often they were starving in prison, they were tortured, they were in solitary confinement. But he wanted to know, why did you do it when you could have not done it? And Timo was so moving in the film when he tells the story. This is also in the book, but to hear him tell it on film is, with the photos that he took, the portraits of these people, is incredible. They talked about how some of their greatest moments of freedom in their life was there in prison when everything had been stripped from them except God. And because they knew they were dwelling in truth, and not just in truth in the abstract, but with the truth who is a living being, the source of all our being, God in Jesus Christ. And that is ultimately the lesson of Live Not by Lies, about how, we don't have the sort of totalitarianism they did in the Soviet times, a totalitarianism enforced with the barrel of a gun and with the Gulag Archipelago, things like that. But we still are captive to that. Our minds are captive to that mindset, the mindset of going along to get along, of living by lies, things that we know are lies because it's just easier to conform. And the testimony of these people who are willing to sacrifice comfort and even liberty for the sake of the truth, man, that's something we need to hear today, because none of us really have to face the kind of sacrifices they did. Prison, yet. That's coming in the UK, perhaps. But we still have to sacrifice. And if there are people who are not, if you're not willing to sacrifice your job or your social network or even any little thing, even social disapproval for the sake of the truth, then who are you? You sacrificed your humanity.
Right. And your TV series is beautiful, hosted by Angel Studios. It's a 4-part series that features Angel.com. Yes. And it features these heartbreaking testimonies that are so important to all of us. So I encourage listeners to watch the series. It's beautiful, giving voice to those who are too often forgotten and who have something to say that very much concerns all of our lives.
Oh, Audrey, isn't it not incredible to you? And you're a lot younger than I am, but I bet you had the same experience as I did. We learned nothing about communism in school, in college.
Right.
I mean, I grew up during the Cold War, and you could hear some things about it on TV. But after that, it was like it all went down the memory hole. Even today, you can turn on the History Channel, And there are 100 documentaries about Nazism, very few about communism. Why is that, do you think?
Well, and even worse than that, I studied Russian and East European studies at the University of Chicago, and I loved my time there in many ways, but I was never assigned to read Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn or Robert Conquest.
University of Chicago.
Correct. We studied Russian and East European history and literature, but there were many voices who we did not study, and I find that damning. Not only do we not study communism enough, but when we do study that crucial period of history, too often we're still taught lies. And it's because it remains inconvenient for our elite class, the very elite who control institutions like the University of Chicago, do not want to contend with the truth. They don't want to engage with the very real criticisms of communism brought forth by brave dissidents.
Yeah, and just the other day, Cambridge University, one of the world's great universities, conferred an honorary doctorate on Angela Davis, the Black radical communist academic in the U.S., whose list of awards includes the Lenin Peace Prize. You know, she's one of history's bad actors.
Yeah.
And yet,
Mm-hmm.
you know, she's this honored figure. Mm-hmm. It's incredible. In the Live Not by Lies book, I mentioned talking to this 26-year-old girl from California. I know her family. I didn't name her in the book. She was raised in a church-going conservative family. And she told me when I saw her on holiday, she said, you know, I'm a communist. Like, wait, I'm sorry, what? Oh, I'm a communist. Like, well, why are you a communist? She said, oh, it's so beautiful. The brotherhood of man, everybody is equal, etc. I said, well, what about the Gulag? She said, the what? She didn't know. Nobody ever told her.
No idea.
And she was raised, again, in a conservative church-going family, but it just went right down the memory hole. And as it turns out, her boyfriend was a Spanish communist. So when they broke up, she was a capitalist again. But the point simply is, so many of these people of your generation are so susceptible to this. A woman I talked to, she came to the U.S. from the Soviet Union, and she taught on faculty at a small state university in the American Midwest. She said, Rod, I look out over my classroom of all these kids straight from the cornfields of Iowa, Nebraska, wherever, and they all say they're socialist. And I tell them, you have no idea what socialism is. They just look at me blinking like, oh, that's the professor. She had a tough time, but she said there's just something in them that will not accept things that they don't want to hear. Maybe they're on the pill of Murti-Bing too, in their own way. They want to believe that a better world is possible, as the communists say. You know, well, as Camilla Bendova, one of the real heroes of Live Not by Lies, both the documentary and the book, as she said, you know, we should want a better world, but if anything that tells us that we can make a perfect world is going to be monstrous, it's a law of history.
Yes, it's a false and very, very dangerous promise. But hearing you speak, I'm reminded of one of your pieces on Substack recently, which I really enjoyed, and it gave me hope for my generation and the next generation, because you shared this tweet posted on July 31st by Robert Sterling, and I want to read part of it. The tweet says, "The left has no idea the monster they've created with Gen Z men. Absolutely no idea. These guys spent their formative years navigating an unprecedented social experiment. COVID lockdowns, DEI struggle sessions, pronouns, microaggressions, land acknowledgements, intersectional justice, and as a demographic, they simply snapped. They stopped fearing cancellation. They realized black marks on social credit scores don't leave permanent stains. And they started owning, rather than futilely trying to defend against, the accusations of villainy they had suffered since young age. It's a wholesale reactionary movement against a political system. More than that, a culture at large, which rightly or wrongly they see as dedicated to their emasculation. So finally, we have young men in particular, I tend to agree with this tweet, who are waking up, realizing perhaps the pill that they have been seduced by and the lies they had fallen prey to, and just how dehumanizing and emasculating it was. And what's next? What's your reaction?
Yeah, well, I have a mixed reaction. On the one hand, of course, I'm delighted that this has happened. They're finally standing up. On the other hand, what are they standing up for? And this is something that concerns me. When last couple of times I've been back in the U.S., I'll talk to friends of mine who are conservatives, often conservative Christians, academics, whether they teach in high school or in college. And they say that so many of the young men they're dealing with have gone so far right, they're openly embracing anti-Semitism and racism and fascism. They even have good things to say about Hitler. Now, it's not all of them, but it's enough of them to really unnerve my friends. My friends who agree that these guys should stand up against these lies, but they've gone so far to the other side. And I think this reminds me of that famous line from Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist. This is probably going to be in his obituary, even though he said it like in 2006. He said, if you don't like the religious right, wait till you see the post-religious right. Mm. And that's what I think we're seeing when you see some of these young guys getting red-pilled by Nick Fuentes or Andrew Tate, the misogynist. It's really scary because it's one thing to react against something bad, but if you're not running towards something good and truthful and holy, I would say, then you're in trouble. I don't want to live in a right-wing totalitarian society any more than I want to live in a left-wing one. And we mustn't forget what I think is the most important thing Solzhenitsyn ever said, of many. He said he learned in the Gulag that the line between good and evil doesn't run between states, doesn't run between classes. We might add, it doesn't run between races or sexes. It runs right down the middle of every human heart. And that humility, that very Christian insight, is absolutely vital. So, and one of the things too that really got to me about doing this project, the Live Not by Lies project, is the forgiveness that the men and women who came out of the Gulag had for their captors. They weren't saying that, oh, it's all okay. They knew it was evil, but they also knew that if they held on to that evil in their heart, it would poison them. And this is where I see, Audrey, in our country, the United States, the lack of Christianity, the lack of, and I blame the church for this too, in many ways, because the sort of Christianity that so many of your generation has been given, it's what they call moralistic therapeutic deism, right? It's so weak. It's all about the feels and being entertained and all that. And that gives people nothing. When young people have been confronted with the kind of evil and the lies that you have been over the past few years, MTD, moralistic therapeutic deism, offers them nothing. Do you know, when COVID first started, I'm Eastern Orthodox, a convert to Orthodoxy. I was living in Baton Rouge. We had a small Orthodox mission. We suddenly started seeing an influx of young people in their 20s, some young couples, but mostly young men, coming to the Orthodox faith. And we were excited about it, but, this is kind of odd. Orthodoxy is really weird in an American context. So we would ask them, why are you here? And it was always a variation of the same answer. We're here because COVID has scared us. It has shown us how fragile our civilization is. And we know that the kind of churches we were coming from, usually megachurch evangelicalism, it's not going to give us the roots that we need to survive if things get really bad. And I think that intuition is driving a lot of the people who are young people moving into Orthodoxy or more traditional forms of Catholicism, or even more rigorous forms of Calvinism, because they know that times can get really hard. Times are hard in many ways, and that a casual faith is not going to be enough. I was just in France on the I did a story for the Free Press about the pilgrimage. Every year for the last 43 years, I think, 20,000 young traditionalist Catholics, Latin Mass goers in France do a 3-day pilgrimage walking from Paris to Chartres. The cathedral at Chartres, medieval cathedral, is considered one of the great treasures of the Western Church. And on the way, they stop to camp, they pray together, they sing hymns, and just enjoy being together. And it really, really moves me to talk to these young people. I didn't know what to expect. They were so joyful, and not joyful in any sort of weird, goony church camp way, but really joyful. And I would talk to them, what brings you here? Why are you doing this? And the answers were all along the lines of, we were raised with nothing. And we know that there's got to be something. So we're here looking for meaning, for purpose. We're looking for transcendence. We're looking for community. We're looking for God. Every single thing that these young people want, totalitarianism also promises, but it's a false promise. And this is the real danger we face at this moment in our society. Hannah Arendt pointed out in her great book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, in 1951, that what drives people to totalitarianism is that search for meaning, purpose, community, and direction in life, and a sense that there is something greater. But communism and Nazism were lies. Communism and Nazism would not have been able to find any traction if the church had been the church properly. And that is a challenge, I would say, to all of us. I mean, you and I are here in Hungary talking. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, said something really interesting once. He said, people look to politics for meaning. I can't give you meaning, he said. I'm a politician. I can give you things, by which I guess he meant like subsidies or pass laws. He said, but if the institutions that do bring meaning, the family, the church, schools, arts organizations, and so forth, if they don't step into the space opened by politics and do what they're supposed to do, then any good done for freedom and humanity by politics is going to be fragile and fall apart. He alluded to that the other day. I heard him give an address at the annual Tusványos conference in Transylvania, which the Hungarians do every year. And he got kind of wistful at the end of his address. He said that, I believe in 10 years here in this country, Hungary, we're not only going to have to protect our eastern and southern borders from migrants, but also our western border with Austria. And he was making a point about how Western civilization stands or falls on the Christian faith. And he said, and the Christian faith stands or falls on whether or not we parents have passed it on to our kids. The last line of his speech was, we will soon see what kind of parents we have been.
Which is so powerful and so very Hungarian as well. And it's something that brought me to Hungary. We lived not too far from each other for a while in Budapest. I think we have the same favorite pizza place in Budapest.
Manu Plus?
Yes, it's the best. And there's something really crucial about the Hungarian project right now, because the Hungarians recognize, many of them rightly recognize, that the 20th century is a story of men who forgot God, and that the family and God are both necessary to a meaningful, grounded, good life. And of course, things are complicated in Hungary. They're complicated everywhere. Everyone in Hungary does not go to church. I mean, it gets complicated very, very quickly.
It's a very secular society, we have to be honest.
It's very, very secular. And I worry about those my age in Hungary, that they flirt too much with the woke ideology that they find on TikTok, and that they take their beautiful church spires for granted. There is a lot of work to be done in Hungary, and at the same time, there are a lot of thinkers and writers in Budapest right now who are talking about the importance of the family formation, and God. And we're at a conference right now in the Hungarian countryside to talk about the West and what it means to save and defend Europe. And so in closing, I'm realizing I have a couple questions in closing. I would love to hear your thoughts on why Hungary? Why do you live in Hungary right now, for someone who knows very, very little about this small, beautiful country? And also for a young audience who is attempting to re-enchant their lives, who's seeking wonder, what advice do you have that's maybe a little bit more practical? Because it's easy for a conversation like this, which covers so many books and history and philosophy, it's easy for it to feel grandiose and for someone to perhaps agree but not know what to do next. So tell us a little bit about Hungary and also some advice.
Well, I ended up coming to Hungary because I got a job at a think tank called the Danube Institute, but that's not the real reason I came. The real reason I came was as I was traveling through the former Eastern Bloc nations, I really became interested in the spirit of the people here and how much they held on to despite communism. And I settled in Hungary specifically because I was curious to see what Viktor Orban and his political movement, the way they were responding to the crisis of liberalism. And by liberalism, I mean classical liberalism. He has talked about Hungary as he wanted to make it an illiberal democracy. Now, he got in trouble for that, but he went on to explain, I simply mean a Christian democracy. He understands that when we say the word liberal democracy today, it usually means not what we've traditionally thought. It means the rule of managerial liberalism, like from the Democratic Party in the US or from Brussels. He believes in democracy. There's an election coming up and it's going to be a close one. But he believes that we need more than secular liberalism, that the West is falling apart because it has forgotten its roots, not only in God, but in the nation itself. One of the things I admire the most about the Hungarians is their fierce awareness of themselves as a people. They have had to suffer so much over the centuries. They are geographically in a terrible place. They've been invaded so many times. We in the West have forgotten how much the people of this part of the world, not just the Hungarians, but other peoples, suffered to protect the West from Islam. Hungary was occupied for 150 years by the Ottoman Turks. I heard Viktor Orban say once, he goes, we know what it's like. And that's a reason why they're so strong against migration here, because they're afraid they're going to lose their essence as a people. I think the same is true for all of Europe, that they have to rediscover themselves as distinct peoples. And it doesn't mean you hate everybody else. If you're French and you love France, it doesn't mean you hate Germany and Italy and everybody else. But they're in great danger in the age of globalism and mass migration of losing themselves as a people. Hungary says, no, never. We're not going to do that. And last point, I'm sorry to go on so long, but Hungary had one of the worst 20th centuries of any country in the world. If you go to Budapest, everyone wants to go see the Parliament building. It's one of the most beautiful buildings you'll ever see. It's giant. But you wonder, how in the world does a country as tiny as this one, with just under 10 million people, how can they have a building that big? Well, when it was built at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Hungary was a large country. And it was a prosperous country. It was booming. They were so optimistic. This is a monument to their optimism and their pride. And then came World War I. They were on the wrong side of that. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were on the losing side, I should say. And they had imposed on them a treaty that took away 2/3 of their landmass. So in a single stroke, they lost 2/3 of their country. And then came World War II, the siege of Budapest, which destroyed 80% of the city. And then came communism. The point simply is this: the Hungarians are people who have lived tragedy, and they know that life is tragic and you can't count on anything. This is why they have been so fiercely opposed to the war in Ukraine and Western involvement in the war in Ukraine. It's not out of any love for the Russians. They remember the Russians invading them in 1956. It's because they feel like they finally got their country back after this horrible century, and they don't want to be dragged into a war they consider to be unnecessary. So these are some of the reasons why I moved to Hungary. And also I wanted to see what American conservatives can learn from what Orban has done. And I think we've seen that too. And this term, President Trump has realized, as Orban did over 10 years ago, that the so-called neutral institutions under liberalism, like universities, are in fact political actors. Now, they need to be treated as political actors. You know, this is something that was sacrosanct in American politics. This is why you always had Republican politicians complaining about, oh, how liberal the universities are. Well, guess what? We fund them. The taxpayers should have a say in that. Well, Orban didn't recognize that sacrosanct character. He said, if we're funding it, the people should have a say. I think that Trump has learned a lot from the Hungarian experiment. Now, you asked about re-enchantment. That refers to my most recent book called Living in Wonder. And by enchantment, I don't mean like sprinkle magic dust on something so everything is like Disney World. I mean learning how to sense the presence of God everywhere, or at least meaning in things. And I think that the key, I talk in the book about practical things we can do for re-enchantment's sake. But I think one of the most important things is to have a change of mindset and to stop thinking that everything needs to be brought under control. There's a German sociologist named Hartmut Rosa who has a really interesting theory of what he calls resonance. And by resonance, when he says that, I would say enchantment. He said we resonate with something when we sense a connection with it, a living connection with it, whether it's another person or a thing. In order to feel resonant with something, say a forest, you have to be present there and take it into your consciousness. But if you move closer to it in the sense of trying to get it under your control so you can manipulate it, it loses its resonance, it loses its mystery, it loses its enchantment. You have to learn to live in that mid state, of being present there, recognizing it, but not trying to control it. And that might sound really abstract, but it's hard to do because that's the thing we're so afraid of today, of losing control. This technological society we live in tells us everything should be brought under our control. And if we can't control something, then it's frightening to us. We need to learn how to just chill out and not feel that everything has to be brought under control. And also, this sounds so old man, but it's so true, and I'm talking to myself here. Shut the laptop, put the phone away, touch grass, talk to human beings. Realize that in order to feel enchantment, or that the world is enchanted, that it's full of mystery and promise, you need to get out of your head and back into your body. There's a guy named Paul Connerton. He's dead now, but he was an anthropologist at Cambridge University, a Marxist. But he studied small societies and communities that held on to their traditions in modernity. And he said he found that they had four things in common, whatever their traditions were. One, they had a sacred story that told them who they were. Two, they celebrated the sacred story in an unvarying liturgy. Three, they had the shared sense that when they were in this liturgy, that they were taken out of time and connected to transcendence, to their future children and past generations. And finally, I think this is so important, this liturgy involved using the body, because there's something, said Connerton, about worshiping with the body that sediments the sacred story into your bones. Now, that's a religious way of talking, but I think it's generally true about how we live our normal lives. The more we live an embodied life, the more we're fighting against this machine that's trying to disembody us and tell us that let AI tell us what to do, let the algorithm tell us what to do to relieve us of the burden of being free. And I think that, to circle back to how we started, we're all running the risk of, for the sake of relieving ourselves from the anxiety and the burden of freedom, we're risking allowing our minds to be captive to the algorithm. And that is the great fear I have, more even the totalitarianism, that we'll surrender our freedom for the sake of being relieved from the burden of freedom.